Hello everyone and welcome back to Social Movements. I am here on time this weekend. I'm very thrilled that I'll be able to put this out for you on Sunday night so that you have it for Monday. Now that the election for school board is over and some things have calmed down just a little bit, I'm ready to buckle down and finish off this semester, as I'm sure you are too. We have just about a month left. So that is A, exciting, but also B, pressuring, because of course we do have a major assignment due at the end during your finals week. So, whoops, we need to make sure that we get that done. If you haven't started yet, I would recommend that you do. You still have plenty of time. You also still have plenty of time to get your 3 annotated bibliographies put on the discussion board. Now, I have not graded those of you who have put them up yet. Some of you told me you put up 1, but you didn't know whether to put up all 3 or not. Yes, please do so. Go ahead and do that. This week, we are talking about violence, essentially, in social movements. And I'm going to talk about a couple of different theorists that I have not mentioned and that you don't have in your book, but I'm going to give you just enough information that you need to know. And if you want to explore those theorists more in depth, you should feel free to do that whenever you're working on your paper or some other time. But I'm just going to give you the very, very briefest of introductions into some of the concepts that theorists have come up with that I think helps us understand social movements a little bit better. Now, one thing I do want to mention is that one of the authors that's listed in your book, his name is Joshua Atkinson, is someone I went to school with and I know very well. And he has always studied sort of the response of anti-establishment rhetoric, and he studies something called FLAC, which is the feedback that anti-establishment groups get from either government or mainstream organizations that they're fighting with, basically from their opposition. What kind of blowback is there if you do initiate some sort of violent rhetoric or some sort of, I don't want to say like an incursion, but essentially that. Your book used to talk about this as violence in social movements, and I used to talk about it a little bit differently because of that. Now they're talking about justifying measures in a social movement. So I'm going to look at this from a justification point of view. And I want you to know that I personally never, ever, ever, ever see a reason that violence should be used in violent tactics, should be used, even threats should be used in a social movement. And I'm going to tell you the main reason why. And that reason is this. If you read Aristotle's The Ethics, he tells us that the practice of rhetoric, a rhetorical act, requires goodwill towards your audience, and therefore any rhetoric that isn't true or does not demonstrate goodwill to the audience is not rhetoric at all. It's something completely different. Coercion, violence, these are separated out for a reason, and for good reason. So when your book talks about justifying violence, I understand why, but at the same time, it's not something I would ever engage in. Another reason why I would never engage in it is because if you recall our cycle of social movements, there's that point where you're in maintenance, right? You're in the maintenance stage. And it's really hard to maintain a social movement because you have to keep it going. And in your book, they address something where they talk about creating a crisis, right? They don't mean a violent crisis, but some people use this as a justification that if your movement is starting to lose steam, so to speak, if you're starting to lose your audience, your membership, and people aren't paying attention to you anymore, that created crisis that a lot of people turn to is violence. Let's start a riot, or let's go do something to them, or let's put a violent image on the internet, something along those lines that sort of makes people feel like there is a real need for the social movement. Personally, I prefer crises to be things like finding a new problem that needs to be solved and making people aware of that problem. The third thing I want to say about justifying is the justification of war. which I'll be honest with you, I'm not a big fan of that theory. I'm not a big fan of it as a social practice. Does it happen? Absolutely. Is it happening right now? Absolutely. We just attacked Iran last night or the night before. I'm really shot on when the time frames are, but we shot back at them because they attacked Israel. So there's a lot going on in the world that we are justifying in various different ways. Now you might think to yourself, wow, nothing's that extreme, Dr. Dudash Buskirk. That's not true. There is a movement in the country to support groups like the Proud Boys. They're a movement. I'm trying to think of the names of the other movements that go along with that, but essentially those movements that have been around for a while, to be honest with you, it's not like they're new, and they are the ones who thought we have to physically take back our government. This is not a metaphorical thing. This is not a philosophical thing. This is a physical thing. And so what did they do? Well, they created violence to let the people know what was really wrong in America in their true belief system. I am not judging that they truly believe that this was the right thing to do. And so there was the, whichever way you want to word it, the attack on the Capitol, the insurgents on the Capitol, the protest at the Capitol, that just used pretty violent tactics. You can call it whatever you want to call it, but it was a movement that turned to violent acts and threats in order to get what they want. And ultimately it didn't work. It didn't work because of, honestly, one person, and that was Mike Pence. Had Mike Pence kowtowed to what President Trump wanted him to do, we would be in a very different America right now, right? So could they have succeeded? Absolutely. Do I think if they tried it again, they would succeed? I don't think so. I think that the vice president for 2024, going into 2025, when you actually hand over the presidency through Congress, I believe that process will be extremely well guarded this year. Obviously, they're going to be very cautious in making sure that nobody attempts to use violent acts. What's scary about it is that we are hearing the same rhetorical strategies coming from President Trump as we did in 2020. Those rhetorical strategies include things like, what was it he said the other day? Well, I don't know if he said it. Somebody said there will be blood in the streets. And I don't know if it was if he gets convicted of a crime, if he ends up in jail, or if he is not elected. It was all along those lines. And you may be able to find examples of exactly what I'm talking about because it is in the mainstream media. And here's something that's really interesting about that particular movement in our country is that it is flat out. It is right there. They do not question what they're doing. They do not have a problem with what they're doing. They see it as justified. So when your book talks about justifiable violence, this is exactly what we're talking about. They believe it's absolutely justified to keep democracy, which is an interesting philosophy in of itself that I'm more than willing to debate with anybody or discuss with anybody another time. I don't think this is the right time though, because most of the times when I'm discussing our philosophy of government, a democracy, some people want to argue with me about the difference between a republic and a democracy. I'm only willing to engage that if people acknowledge that a republic is a democracy, by the way. But if you want to do that, I'm more than willing to engage that. I'm more than willing to engage how violence is not a part of the democratic system. And therefore, I don't believe that violence should be used as a tactic in social movements or any other rhetoric, because not only is it not rhetoric, according to Aristotle, not only is it not a sign of goodwill, but it's also not an argument. So I'm going to make a couple of I guess, questionable statements. And when I say questionable, I mean that they are definitely debatable. I've had this debate in my classroom before with my social movement classes. So understand that I'm not asking you to agree with me. I'm just telling you some of my perspective, and you can, sort of look into your own perspective. Violence is not rhetoric. Violence is not a rhetorical act. Violence in of itself does not send a message. It's all the stuff that surrounds violence that is rhetorical, that is a message, that is trying to be persuasive. Okay? Violence in of itself is not rhetoric because it's not persuasive. It is coercive and it is threatening, and that's it, which means that you're appealing to fear. And trying to scare someone into doing something is also coercion. It's not persuasion. So if I'm going to engage in persuasion in a social movement, for me, I have to not use violence by definition. So again, that's just me. It is difficult to argue that position sometimes because people say, well, violence is a message in of itself. We're destroying you. And I'm like, that's not rhetoric. That's not a message. That's an act with physical repercussions. While there is such a thing as words having impact, it's a different impact than the actual violence. For example, if I say we will attack you if you attack us, that's very different from us just attacking, right? Or being responsive when somebody attacks us by just simply attacking back. So these are very different things, and hopefully most of us recognize that difference. I always say that rhetoric can be violent, but violence is never rhetoric or rhetorical. So there you go. Now, one of the theorists I want to talk about is a theorist that some of you have probably heard of. If you're in my 350 class, you just heard about it last week, and that is Kenneth Burke. Kenneth Burke is known for seeing the world as a drama. It is a whole paradigm for him called the dramatistic perspective. Some people have talked about language from the dramatistic perspective as being what they call dramaturgical. This is a word that sort of implies that we don't just live out our drama, but that we actually use it in our language and in our symbols. So our language and our symbols are essentially our way of knowing what's going on in the drama in the world. Now, this is actually fantastic for studying social movements. Why? Because overcoming sort of the oppositional problem in social movements can be looked at as very simply an argument of one side and another, right? Very simple. But if you turn that from a dramatistic perspective, when we look at that as two opposing things, what we end up doing is not looking at it more as like an argument or an oppositional debate. We start to look at it as two opposing forces in a story, in a drama. And therefore, we put them into very extreme categories. And Burke talks about these as God terms and devil terms. God terms, of course, are being those that are of extreme good and paramount good. Devil terms being paramount evil, okay? And so these God terms and devil terms are so strong that you can't really debate that they are that. For example, if I say all violence is the end of the world, all violence is so evil, there is never a justification for violence, versus violence leads to transcendence. Violence sends the ultimate message. Violence is necessary to get a message across. So now we are creating an opposition of these in very, very much God and devil terms. Probably the best example of this is actually with reproductive justice. Okay. Now, I have lived since 1974 It is the smallest population of that year. I mean, that year is the smallest population of birth rate in the States. Now, I say that because in 1973 Roe v. Wade was codified, right? So that became a law, a protection, a right for a woman to have an abortion in a healthy environment, as healthy as those get. So in 1974 we saw a plummet of birth, and that makes sense, right? There were women out there who fundamentally believed that they needed to have an abortion who couldn't get one prior to 1973. They just, I mean, or if they did, it was a risk to their health. They may not survive it. All those other things. My mother used to tell me about a girl she knew in high school who got pregnant, and so she threw herself down a set of stairs in order to lose the baby. And she was successful. To me, those acts are justification for being, what's the word? We used pro-choice and pro-life back then. And the pro-lifers were people like my parents who 100% believed that there was never a justification for an abortion because you are killing a human being. Now, if I fundamentally believe that that a zygote or a couple of cells are in fact a human being, then yeah, I could see how I might see this as problematic and murder. But what I know now that I didn't know then is that scientifically that's just not the case. And I also know that in my worldview, you don't have to agree with me on that. In my worldview, which has changed over time, I was 100% pro-life until I moved here, actually, in 2006, which really doesn't make a whole hell of a lot of sense because I'm one of those people who was told when she was 27, you can't have any children. And it would be incredibly dangerous for you to get pregnant. And the reason for that is that I am not able to carry a child. So I could get pregnant, but I couldn't, my body could not carry the child. And so either we both would die or the child would die, for example. So it was also possible that if I let a pregnancy occur, it was likely that I would die because my insides would essentially not be able to hold the baby and potentially implode. Not in a violent way, but my insides would literally stop working. So these are some of the problems that I started to encounter. And of course, whenever a problem comes to you, whenever it becomes personal, we start to think differently about perhaps how we feel. And we hear people tell these stories all the time, right? And we would hear people talk about how they really thought they would be okay, and it turned out that it was either them or their baby, and how hard of a decision that was. We've heard about victims of rape, of incest rape. We've heard a lot of different cases come up, 10-year-old girls, 11-year-old girls, even 15-year-old girls, in my humble opinion. You know, we should not force them to deal sometimes with what problems can come with the pregnancy that results from a rape or from incest. Incest to me includes rape because I don't think most people have a choice there. So it starts to get more complicated, and the more science we learn, the more complicated it gets, right? And on the other side of that debate, when I was in high school, of course I went to a Catholic high school, so this doesn't surprise me really. They showed us all 4 years. We had to watch a movie called The Silent Scream, which showed a sonogram of a baby being aborted. And at one point, when the doctor pushes in, I don't know what it was some instrument, that the baby's head went back and the mouth opened, and they called that a scream of pain. This was very traumatizing for a lot of people, myself included, but it later came out that that was not at all what was happening in that video. What was happening in that video was that it would be normal when you move liquid around for the weakest part and the heaviest part of the body to push up and flow back. So it would be pretty normal if, there was something that disturbed the fluid, let's say quickly, even air forcefully, it would make the baby go up. Baby is, I'm not sure what else to call it, fetus, whatever you want to label it. It would make that happen. So it turns out that that was not a scream of pain. We don't really know that there's any pain. We assume not, because they're not fully developed. I mean, they're not even close to developed at the time that most people have abortions. But this was a very effective message. And the idea that you're committing murder if you provide abortions is pretty strong. And then they went even further, the pro-life side, and this was when I really started to question things. They would go and shoot doctors who performed abortions. And this was happening long after Roe was codified. Okay, so it was just, that's just flat out murder. You're shooting a doctor. Now we could debate whether or not that doctor was performing murder or not, but that would be a different debate, in my opinion. And so I started to really think about that. I was like, well, no, wait a minute. If it's murder to perform an abortion, isn't it also murder to go and kill somebody who's standing up and doing a job? Yeah, that's probably murder, and it risked a lot of other people. And so there were a lot of extreme tactics on the one side that turned to violence. Now, on the other side, the pro-choice side, if you will, I'm going to call it reproductive justice from now on, but that side in the 80s and 90s, they weren't going around shooting people. Did they show pictures of women who were in trouble because they were pregnant? Did they show pictures of a hanger, which was one of the ways that women used to give themselves abortions prior to Roe? That idea that if we didn't keep Roe, that women would die in back alleys because they were going to doctors who would basically harm them, or the surgery would go wrong, or it was unclean. These two extreme God and devil terms, and I'm not even sure which one to go with. I guess God over here and devil over here. I'm not sure. These God and devil terms were actually kind of interesting because, at least on one side of this, it was a little bit more nuanced. Actually, on both sides, it was pretty nuanced. If you look at the reproductive justice side, there were places that women could go to get a good, clean, healthy abortion, but you had to have the money. You had to have the means to do it, right? And on the other side, there were times when, I don't know, whoever's in charge, if you believe in, for them, it was God, would, I don't know, whoever. We have what's known as a spontaneous abortion. A lot of times we call it a miscarriage, which, by the way, both of those terms drive me up a wall from different reasons. And again, something we could discuss another time. These labels that they gave them. Let's think about this for a second. On every hospital record where a woman has had a miscarriage, it is listed as a spontaneous abortion. And so legitimately now that Roe is essentially overturned. I mean, Dobbs is actually a lot stricter. With the Dobbs decision, we are curious if it goes back to the states, and you have states like Arizona who adopt an 1864 law. Could I be tried for murder if somebody goes back and looks in my records and sees that I had a spontaneous abortion because of the label that we've given it? And so what I'm trying to show you here is how important language is in a movement when we're affecting the large audience, which is what we're trying to do, right? You're trying to impact as many people as possible. In the reproductive justice side, we're looking at the entire country is what we're trying to impact, or at the very least, a state. right? So it's big. And so using God and devil terms is really the only way that you're going to get through making your argument in the best way possible, and not having to explain all these little nuances, of I support abortion, but only in the cases of rape and incest. That's something I hear a lot. And my question always is why are those the only two? And how many women have been able to prove rape? How do we know that's the case? I mean, that seems like a pretty abstract, or at least amorphous line to draw, right? And so if we get into the weeds, as we say, with these God and devil terms, we really run into some problems in that debate. And so most of the time in the public sphere, we leave that up to it sorting itself out somewhere. And then we end up in individual debates, right? And so what you have is sort of, if we didn't have organized, mass influence, social groups like social movements, there would be sort of a mass hysteria that goes on, okay? So what we need to do is understand that in looking at a social movement as a drama, the God and devil terms are useful until they lead to violence, because then a rhetorical act becomes a material act, okay? And that might violate law more than anything else. I'm sorry I used that example, except we're about to see a huge rise in movements. I mean, we're already seeing them in movements for reproductive justice. And I call it reproductive justice. I label it that. I'm going to explain why, because there may be some of you who disagree with that label. I'm using that label for me because, to me, a young girl who gets pregnant however she gets pregnant, whose body cannot handle a pregnancy, or someone who's incredibly poor, who gets raped and gets pregnant, or someone who's not informed, an uninformed person, and there are several, believe it or not, about birth control, or someone who's too poor to access birth control and ends up in a situation. All of these things seem to me like they're a question of justice, right? It's a question of justice. Do we want to let that person die, suffer, let the child suffer, all of these things, like economically, how do we justify what we're doing, right? And on the other side of that, I might want everybody to have access to forms of birth control that don't include abortion, but at least I can give them that. The problem is, with the way that we're wording things, even those things are getting filtered out. It's pretty fundamentally scary when you really dig into things like the Arizona law. And Chris, oh gosh, I can't remember his name. He has a nighttime talk show, news show. He was talking the other day about how, where this 1864 law came from in Arizona. Now, do I have time to explain this to my social movement peeps? Probably not. The guy who created that was appointed by Abraham Lincoln, and he was married 5 times to children. I'm talking about people under the age of 16, children. The age of consent was 10. 10 years old was the age of consent. He pushed for all of these anti-abortion movements and medications, saying that if you provided anything that would end up in the destruction of a pregnancy, that you would be considered for murder. So that's where that started in Arizona, in the territory. But on the other side of that, here we are in 2024, and our former president, and if I did not see this on TV and verify it, I would not have believed it, but went on TV and said that Democrats want people to abort children when they're 9 months old. when they're 9 months pregnant and even beyond that. What? Think about that for a second. What he's saying is that Democrats, and again, I mean, that's a real generalization, right? Democrats want to allow murder. And the thing is that I don't know about you. I don't know if you've ever seen a woman who's pregnant at 9 months. They might say things like, I can't wait to get this thing out of me. But they have already bought stuff for the nursery. They've picked out names. They're excited to be a mom. This is not a question at 9 months. At 9 months, you've chosen, so to speak. Or at least it used to be a choice. Now it's not so much a choice. So anyway, there's a lot that goes into the reproductive justice debate. And there's a lot that goes into the movements of the reproductive justice debate. It's no longer pro-life, pro-choice. We can't go with those labels anymore, because as much as those were God and devil terms throughout the 90s and early 2000s, they don't work anymore because they don't describe either side appropriately. I'm going deep into this sort of example because I want you to understand that when you do your analysis for your paper, I don't want you just to surface glaze over it and say, oh, well, this is a social movement and it was successful, done. I want you to really think about sort of the rhetorical constructions that had to happen. And that leads me to a second theorist that they mention in your book very, very briefly, and that's Lloyd Bitzer. In 1973, Lloyd Bitzer wrote an article called The Rhetorical Situation, and in it he talks about exigencies and opportunities, right, that we have when we go into a rhetorical situation. That is, when a speech is demanded or a message is demanded, we end up in a rhetorical situation. Now, the book does not talk about this in a very deep way at all whatsoever, and it kind of drives me nuts because the only thing they talk about are exigencies and these parts of the situation that make certain rhetoric necessary. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to post that original article from 1973 on Blackboard for you to read and look at, because I think it's helpful to understanding where all of these different exigencies, if you will, and opportunities come from whenever we're sending a message that is rhetorically constructed. Okay, whenever we're practicing rhetoric, you're in a rhetorical situation whether you know it or not. So it's important to understand it. And I think that reading that article will give you a lot more insight into what your textbook is trying to tell you. So I'm going to go ahead and provide that for you as well. So your book today, this week, is only talking about justifying violence for the most part. And it's picking and choosing the things that it wants to try to find a way to say that justifying violence is important. I don't think that the authors agree with that. I think what's going on is some movements resort to violence, period. There's nothing we can do about that. But how do we study that? How does that fit into a rhetorical perspective of social movements? What does that mean for our understanding of social movements? And so, as always, I will let you read those examples in your book. And I'm going to provide you with that article by Lloyd Bitzer. And I want you to think about the intricacies of a movement, because those are the things that lead to violence. It's not like somebody wakes up one day and goes, boy, I'm really against abortion. I'm going to go shoot a doctor. That's not how this works. It builds up based on the details of how we rhetorically construct the movement. Okay, that's all I'm going to say for today because that was pretty deep, and I'm giving examples left and right, and I could go on forever. I want to thank you. Some of you wrote to me that you really hate conspiracy theories, and I was kind of surprised by that because I absolutely love them. And you know, we all have strong feelings apparently about conspiracy theories, which I think is well, it's awesome. We need all sorts of different perspectives, and I hope that no matter how you feel about conspiracy theories, whether you love them or hate them, or you're somewhere in between, that you understand how they play a role in social movements. And I think that film, to be honest with you, that film the silent scream. It was propaganda. I mean, it could be labeled that way because it was supposed to be persuasive, but it was based on flawed science. But for me, it's a conspiracy theory, probably involving the Catholic Church and a lot of other organizations that were so anti-choice that they chose, or that they showed us these videos when we were teenagers, right? Okay, hope that helps you understand the chapter on violence in our book. We're winding down, just a few more chapters to go. As always, if you have any questions or concerns or whatnot, just send me an email or give me a call or pop me a text. All right, I'll talk to you next week.